We're 8 weeks into 2016, and already 8 members of our nation's law enforcement have been killed in the line of duty. And where are President Obama's statements to the loved ones of the 8 members of the law enforcement we've lost? Better yet, where are Bernie's and Hillary's statements? We hear outraged comments from the left on Tamir Rice, Mario Woods, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, but the silence is deafening about the deaths of these 8 heroes in blue. Bernie and Hillary are so focused on pandering to the Black Lives Matter movement, trying desperately to get the black vote all to themselves, they can't even comment on police officer deaths. It's sickening. The GOP frontrunner Donald Trump said police officers are the most mistreated people in the world. At least he's saying something to address the problem. And then our boys in blue. If our politicians won't speak out about this awful, awful violence, they'll band together and speak for themselves. Take a look.
And I'm going to let you know right from the beginning, I'm a nobody. I'm just a brother in blue who has a heart and who cares. We've lost 6 brave warriors in the last 6 days. And I want to speak to the wives and the children, the mothers and the dads of these 6 fallen heroes. Because we see your pain. We feel your pain.
It's heartbreaking, isn't it? This police officer named Chuck goes on to say the police community knows the families of the slain officers will never hear from our administration. Somehow, Chuck, though you describe yourself as a nobody, you aren't. Your words are more sincere, more genuine, more heartfelt, more comforting than any politically motivated remarks could ever have been anyway. Joining me now to talk about the growing threats in our communities against our law enforcement officials is President and Executive Director of Americans in Support of Law Enforcement, Scott Erickson. Scott, it's a pleasure to see you.
It's good to be back.
Now, we've lost 8 members of our law enforcement in the first 8 weeks of this year. 8 law enforcement officials. That's a high number, Scott.
It's extremely high, and I think it's important to note that of the 6 officers that were killed in the line of duty last week, 5 were shot to death within 24 hours.
Yeah, it's just dreadful. In this same period last week, the first 8 weeks, there was only 1 law enforcement official that was killed. How is the disparity possible?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, we don't know right now whether or not this is simply a tragic coincidence or if it's emblematic of a sort of a broader movement toward increased violence against law enforcement. Over the past couple of years, we've seen increased violence against law enforcement. We've seen more officers feloniously killed in the line of duty in the past few years than we saw in the years preceding. And it tended to coincide with the sort of public uproar over the aftermath of Ferguson and Staten Island and other police controversies. So it's hard to say at this point whether this is, again, emblematic of a broader trend or if it's simply a tragic coincidence. Either way, it's something that we should all be cognizant of and disappointed in.
Now, you've been there. You've been out in the communities. You've seen this. Do you generally see trends occur between politicians when they're race baiting, like so many of the politicians are right now, when there are riots, when there are killings? Do you see a trend that affects not just in the days or weeks afterward, but that would affect months later?
Well, I think it's, you know, politicians, sometimes their words resonate, sometimes they don't. I think that what we see today, especially with the president and what we see with Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, their lack of recognition for what's going on in the law enforcement community, that is emblematic of a broader trend toward negativity and anger toward law enforcement. We've seen that over the past few years. I think they're playing off of that. Obviously, it seems to be they're pandering for electoral purposes. They're both, you know, mired in the midst of a contentious presidential race. They're both vying for their share of the extreme left of their party. And it's within that constituency that we usually see individuals who are prone to the anti-law enforcement rhetoric.
Now, where does this anger come from, though, when we're peeling it back, not just today, not just last month, not just last year, not just the last 5 years? Where does this stem from? Because police officers are inherently good people. As with any profession, there's always going to be a handful of bad apples that make mistakes, that are bad, that are corrupt, maybe even that are evil. But the majority in the history of our country have been good men and women who are serving our communities, keeping people safe. I don't understand where this negativity, this hatred comes from.
It depends on the individual, but for some people, it's a general worldview that sees prejudice and injustice inherent to government, and they see that within law enforcement. I think for some communities, it's representative of generations of mistrust between the police and that particular community. And that isn't necessarily always the fault of the community or the fault of law enforcement. So every community is idiosyncratic. Every individual, why they have certain feelings toward law enforcement, it's highly shaped by their own experiences within their lives. But what I think is most disconcerting is when you see people engage in certain negativity toward law enforcement that is obviously almost solely in the form of pandering and for electoral benefit. That undermines law enforcement. It undermines public safety. It does nobody any good except in the eyes of the politician, the individual that's saying it.
Right, and I'll go ahead and call out someone who's doing that right now, and that's Bernie Sanders. He recently said he was sick and tired of seeing unarmed black men shot by police. And Scott, he compared police to occupying armies.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know where he's coming from with that, other than to say, again, he's pandering to the extreme left of his party. I'm sure he'll try and walk that back if he were to become the nominee. The same goes for Hillary Clinton. She would probably try to walk back some of her rhetoric if she, in fact, becomes the nominee. Look, the bottom line is the overwhelming majority of Americans have faith in law enforcement. And although the public's faith in law enforcement has taken a slight hit over the past few years, the public still supports law enforcement. In fact, law enforcement is considered to be the third most respected institution in society. In a Gallup poll that was conducted last year, in the midst of this anti-police hysteria, law enforcement ranked just below small business owners and the military in terms of faith in those institutions. So, look, we focus on a lot of the negativity, we focus on a lot of the extreme rhetoric, but at the end of the day, the majority of Americans support law enforcement. And that's why I think you see a number of politicians and public officials coming out and supporting law enforcement as well.
Right, and then Donald Trump even said that police officers are the most mistreated group in America. And I generally don't like to buy into victim mentality too much because I don't think it leads to anything good. But sometimes, Scott, it really does seem like that might be an accurate statement.
Well, I think right now law enforcement is certainly everyone's favorite punching bag. And again, it's unfortunate because you're not just hurting the individual officers. Police officers are going to continue doing their jobs. They're going to continue to risk their lives every day, as we saw last week with the number of officers killed in the line of duty. They're going to continue to do the work that's necessary to protect the public. But the institution itself begins to suffer because faith in that institution begins to suffer when you continue to berate and denigrate a profession and hundreds of thousands of people and all of their loved ones by continually kicking them. Eventually that has a negative impact on the public's perception. And so when the public perception becomes negative toward law enforcement, it undermines that essential relationship between law enforcement and the public. It's that relationship which allows effective policing to occur. And when that is eroded, you see public safety suffer.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right on that, Scott. We're almost out of time for this segment, but I want to touch on one more thing. In Tampa, there are some law enforcement officers who are refusing to sign up to help protect an upcoming Beyonce concert because they think that her halftime performance at the Super Bowl was inciting against police officers, which I would 100% agree with them. But is that appropriate for them to decline protecting her concert?
Well, look, I think I'm shocked if anyone's surprised that law enforcement officers in Tampa or Miami or anywhere else would be reluctant to sign up to work overtime to provide security for somebody who they feel has very recently and very publicly rebuked them. So I don't see how that's a shock. Now, look, the police are going to effectively provide security for the concerts. They're going to provide adequate security for every event that occurs in Tampa and Miami. It's the duty of law enforcement to do that. But I don't think we should be surprised to see law enforcement officers not jumping out of their seats to volunteer to work these things. I wouldn't be shocked to see that what should be a voluntary assignment, in fact, turns into a mandatory assignment because nobody signs up to do it.
Right, and maybe this will be the wake-up call that Beyonce needs to understand her double standard, that she was berating the people who were actually keeping her safe and protecting her while she's making her own living. Scott, I appreciate you coming on the show today. It was great to talk to you.
Thank you.